Cool. Let's hear from Benji in Alabama, who I guess has some questions about secular morality. Benji, what's on your mind?
You with
Howdy,
us,
sir.
Benji?
You're hearing us. Okay. Well, we will work to get that sorted out. Benji, I'm going to put you back in the queue and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. In the meantime, Scott, I'm curious from your perspective, do you share my concerns at all that I brought up at the top of the show? You know, is it just an occupational hazard of mine as a therapist, or do you see this sort of like over intellectualizing aspect of our community?
Well, what's interesting is somebody watching the show might look at us and they might see, Scott, you're the math teacher, that's the logic side, and then Christy, you're the therapist, that's the therapy, that's the emotional side.
Got a left brain, right brain situation.
But in many ways, I mean, we can interpret that we could reverse that. I mean, yeah, I'm a math teacher, but I'm not a mathematician. I'm an educator. So my job is to really make the math content meaningful to my students, whereas you as a professional therapist, your job is to apply the science to your clients, different situations.
Try and take all those big emotions and organize them and give them a framework and a logic.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think in that way, we're both very similar, is that both of our careers kind of integrate these two, or these things that appear to be these two different kinds of forces. But to answer your question about do we see this as over intellectualization? And I would say yes and no. One, yes, it's very easy to focus on things like logic, especially when you're talking to somebody who you think is failing on the logical side of things. But I do think I wouldn't necessarily use the word over intellectualizing, because thinking about emotion can be a very intellectual process. I mean, it's very deep in analysis. It's very human-centric. And so really what we're talking about here is maintaining some sort of balance between logical approach and incorporating our human emotions in that. And it's one of those, if you're really good at talking about one of those two things, it is in fact very easy to set one of them aside. And I know that talking about emotions, you mentioned Dr. Firth Godby here earlier. He's really, I just love listening to him talk about his field of expertise, that of emotion, in that, he can really quantify things, and he has the knowledge of the history of the subject to really bring that to bear. And so I think it's not so much of a focusing on one thing at the expense of another thing, but I think it's a balance where people can bring their own expectations into it. For example, let's say I wanted to read like a book called Don Quixote. Okay, we've all heard of Don Quixote, and it was originally written in Spanish. And so there's a couple of things that I would need to bring to bear on a problem like that. I'd have to learn how to speak Spanish, for one thing, how I can take the words that are written in Spanish and translate them into concepts and ideas that I'm familiar with. But then once I've done that step, then that only gets me to a point where I am then able to appreciate the literature and the themes and the messages. And so that might represent the emotional side of the balance too. And so they're really two parts accomplishing the same goal, that the idea being to understand somebody's cultural perspective, their sociological perspective, their historical perspective. And so, boy, this is the longest answer to a really very short question. But yeah, I do see that. I see as a math teacher, of course, I'm going to be focusing on mathematics. But as I said before, motivation can be a big part of that, and right. can be a stumbling block for especially new teachers that are having difficulty with that thing. But as you gain experience as a human being, as you interact with your students, you kind of develop that sort of thing. And I would imagine that maybe for a therapist, it might be the flip side. It might be maybe somebody went into therapy to be a therapist because they really care about people. They really maybe have a strong and broad knowledge of emotional states and human emotion and that kind of thing. But as they learn, then they can apply more and more science to to the situation. And so I do see things leaning one way or the other in conversations, but I don't necessarily think that that's something that should be avoided or even a bad thing. I think it's good because then we can survey that landscape and decide what best applies to us and our own approaches to that.
Yeah, no, that notion of balance is super important, but also the idea of translating a word about emotion into another language. I mean, that really lines up with Dr. Firth Godby here's work about how our understanding of emotion has changed time after time after time. These aren't, specific compounds in the body that we can isolate and say like, oh, this is the dopamine feeling, this is the serotonin feeling.
Right.
The way that we interpret emotion, it's just this sort of arbitrary lens that we are applying to these physical sensations. And that's true of thoughts too.
Right.
Thoughts and emotions are really just the different ends of the same spectrum, or maybe not discrete from one another in any meaningful way. And I think that's really valuable in getting this conversation out of that sort of like mind-body dualism, or that notion of like the animus or the soul being somehow separate from the logic or the brain, or all of these kinds of complexities. So there's a lot, I think, to be aware of here as we try to find a healthy balance in our lives.
Right. And I think that word that you used right there, awareness, I think that's key, especially self-awareness and reflective awareness. I think that can, that's really part of it. We are integrating different aspects of the human experience. And I think an awareness of the way other people are reacting and self-awareness, the way that you are reacting, can be very valuable in improving maintaining that balance and also improving both aspects of that at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, beautiful. I think there is so much to get into here, but I'm hearing from the crew that we've got Benji back on the line. So let's jump back on the calls, yeah?
All right.
Okay. Benji in Alabama, what's on your mind today?
Oh.
Okay, well, fair enough. Let's give it one more try. Let's go ahead and touch base with Tucker in Iowa.
All right.
Tucker, are you hearing us?
I think we are narrowing in on the problem here.
Yeah, it seems to be. Okay, well, I'm going to put all of the calls back into the line and trust our incredible crew to get that sorted for us, to let us know when we're ready to go. Yeah, so I guess, Scott, when that balance gets sort of off level, what are the signs or the hallmarks of dismissing emotion in our understanding of things like cosmology or epistemology? Like, when do we know that we're kind of out of step?
Well, that's the tricky part, right? That's the tricky part. That's where that self-awareness comes in. If we're looking for, I think it was it Mark Twain that said, the easiest person to fool is yourself, right? And the hardest person to convince that you've been fooled is yourself. And so it's looking back at yourself in the mirror can be very, very challenging. And so I think that, recognizing, I think the first step would be to admit the possibility that you are not getting a good view of yourself, or you're not taking into consideration certain aspects of your own emotional self. But I think that we need to be able to look back at ourselves and recognizing when we are, in fact, bringing our own emotions into the process. And that can certainly be a benefit. That can, we were talking about before, that drives your passion, that drives your motivation, that can drive your interest as well. But on the flip side of that, we don't want to make sure that we go too far in that direction. We don't want to rely solely on our emotional responses, because history and biology has shown that our emotional responses can be misled. And that's because our intellectual and our emotional selves kind of evolved responding to different aspects of the environment. A book that I read called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, I think when I read that really helped me focus on that particular difference. We have we have our emotional selves that are quick to respond to scenarios and quick to respond to danger, especially. And then we have our slower intellectual self where we can kind of analyze a little bit more deeply, and it's less involved with emotion. And so I think being able to recognize that you have that balance in yourself and being able to recognize when it's off kilter, I think can be very challenging. As you do as well, I wish we could have some kind of like pill that we could take that would fix that for us, right? That would give us that clear view of our own selves. But I think that can be an extreme challenge for everybody. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear what other people have to say. So if anybody wants to call in, we do have open lines and talk to us about that. I'd love to hear people's opinions on this kind of thing, because, people think of things that I haven't thought of, and that helps me to improve myself. So I think it all kind of starts at home, as they say, right? It starts with looking at yourself, and anybody can point the finger at somebody else and say, you're not being logical, or you are reacting inappropriately, or so forth. But in order to recognize that in ourselves, I think takes practice and diligence.
Yeah, I think it's the self-deception part that you kind of zoomed in on that is so significant to me. It's not that I want to like criticize people for being 80% logic and only 20% emotion, or that it would ever or could ever work in that kind of way. But it's when I see people, particularly in our community, who are insistent that like, I'm not an emotional person. Maybe my partner or my children are just too emotional, whereas I operate from pure logic and reason. And then the moment you start to sort of push back, like, really, is your logic and reason like all that pure? You start to see the anger boiling up that they are unself-aware of, that they are in denial about, or unwilling to really acknowledge as meaningful and significant, and not altogether like unhealthy.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's part of the normal human existence, right? It is that type of thing. I mean, we have actually evolved to not notice those kinds of things in ourselves. We've evolved to try to present ourselves as some kind of as leaders and as dominant people and as the one that everybody wants to be. And so admitting weakness is on the surface that can be seen as a weakness, right? The fact that you admit that there are weaknesses. But when you sit back and think about it, you want to make sure that if there are weaknesses there, you want to make sure that that you can recognize that they're there and that you can take steps to move forward. And so, so that the self-awareness, I think, is really, really a key thing. And it's hard to do, especially if you're arguing with somebody about something. Like I said, it's easy to point fingers. It's easy to say what's wrong with their argument. And especially when they're not also doing any self-reflection, right? So if they're telling you that you're doing things wrong, and then you think, well, maybe I am doing things wrong, then it seems like it kind of pushes it one way, and our egos respond instantly with that fiery response. We don't want to be the weak one. We don't want to be the vulnerable one. And I think the willingness to show vulnerability, this is my opinion, but I think the willingness to show vulnerability is really a true sign of strength. And when I'm talking to somebody, if they can be vulnerable and or admit their own weaknesses, to me, I think, okay, that's a strong person. That's somebody that I want to talk to. That's somebody where we can make some progress and we can kind of set aside the egos and really have some good conversations.
Yeah, that vulnerability piece is so challenging here. I mean, do you feel like there is pressure in our community, especially when contrasted with a more like faith-based belief system? Is there pressure on secular people to always sound rational at the expense of being emotionally honest?
I think there is some pressure there. I mean, we can see with the responses that we have to our shows, it's when we have hosts that tear into callers, tear down their logic and that kind of thing, we get a lot of the most positive responses. And it's the longer discussions, the back and forth discussions, the more empathetic approach doesn't necessarily get that strong response. And so I think there is some pressure And I think a lot of that comes from our tendency to have those short-sighted goals, right? That quick, you can point to a line on an argument and say, there's where your logic failed and that kind of thing. And so I think the concreteness of a logical examination makes it easier to get that, that dopamine kick and that ironically, that emotional kickback from pointing at the logic. I think that those short-term benefits, I suppose we call them, make it very easy to move in that direction, both as somebody who's talking to the theist or as somebody who's watching the show, watching somebody else talk to the theist. And so there is pressure, but then there are people that, and these are the hosts that I appreciate the most, and that includes yourself, definitely, the people who do take the extra time to be empathetic, the people that do take the extra time to understand not only what the other person is saying, but why they're saying it and why they're saying it the way they say it and that kind of thing. And I think that can lead to more long-term benefits. That can lead to, that's really the kind of thing that if something is going to convince somebody to become an atheist and abandon their religion, it's going to be those longer conversations that do take those two things into account. And so it's really just a quick response, a quick feedback, a quick, kick of adrenaline or whatever, versus the longer but more ultimately beneficial goal of actually connecting with a human being and making progress together as you explore these truths and untruths.
Yeah, no, all fair to say.